Hello, my name is Garrett Fuentes, and today I'm going to be talking to you about assessments in special education. Okay. So first off, we should discuss what the purpose of assessments in special education is. So special education assessments are used to determine the student's unique strengths and needs, their eligibility for services, strategies that can be used to support that student as well as their family, and progress in relation towards their goals. According to our text, special education assessment is defined as the systematic process of gathering educationally relevant information to make legal and instructional decisions about the provision of special services. The special education process consists of 4 different phases: identification and referral, determination of eligibility, program planning, and program implementation and evaluation. The identification and referral section refers to the process of identifying students with disabilities and the referrals that can come from classroom teachers of students who may potentially have a disability. So this usually takes place in 2 different forms. There is screening, which usually occurs as the student is about to enter elementary school, and pre-referral process, as I mentioned, happens whenever the general education teacher has referred the student for special education assessments. So this referral can occur due to maybe academic struggles, or it can refer to behavioral or emotional struggles that student might have. And so the teacher has most likely, or at least should have, implemented different strategies in the classroom to help support this student. If those strategies have not been successful, then they should refer that student for special education assessment. In most schools, there is also a team that kind of works as a liaison between these 2 stages, so they can provide recommendations for strategies to that classroom teacher that they can use with the student to help that student be as successful as they can without having to be assessed for special education services and misidentified as needing special education services. The next step is the determination of eligibility. So with this step, the student is beginning to be assessed, and once they are assessed, they're going to see if there is a disability, and if there is a disability, they're going to see if that disability has some type of school performance problem. So for example, if the student has, let's just say, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, this student may not have any school performance problems, but ADHD is still, according to the DSM, a disability or disorder that student has. So the most important thing here is that this disability or challenge must have some effect on their school performance. The next step in the process is program planning. So with program planning, the most important step in this is going to be the development of the Individualized Education Plan, or an IEP. The IEP is a legal document that describes what the annual goals are for the student, the supports that they are going to have in the classroom and outside of the classroom. It will clearly state what their disability or their classification of disability is, and it will include lots of other information about the services and other things that are relevant to that student's individualized learning plan. The next step in this process is the program implementation and evaluation. So with this step, the program is implemented, so whatever it is that has been written in the IEP as far as services that are going to be provided, or maybe if the student is going to be pulled for core instruction for math or reading or both, all of those plans will then be put into action. A part of this implementation is also assessing that student's progress towards their annual goals. And so this is usually in the form of frequent progress monitoring, and depending on what that goal is, that can occur in many different ways. It can be observations, it can be through using other types of assessments that might be standardized assessments, or maybe informal types of assessments. And then, most importantly, they're also going to be assessing their eligibility of services. Now, if you'll notice, I also mentioned up here at the top that they are going to determine eligibility. So what this assessing eligibility of services at the bottom is referring to is that every 3 years a student is reevaluated to see if they still qualify for services. So this is what this assessment is. So if the student is placed on an IEP, they've implemented that, and that student has made progress toward their goals, 3 years later, they will be reassessed to see if they still qualify for services. And then if they do still qualify for services, then they are going to, again, revise the plan and see what services need to be added or removed. And then once that has been changed, they're going to then implement that plan. And then again, 3 years later, go back up to the top. So as you're kind of noticing, this is just a cycle that continues to happen. So it starts with the identifying and then moves on to determining their eligibility and planning that program and then putting that program into action and evaluating it. And then depending on how that evaluation goes, the cycle either stops or it goes back up to the top and again reevaluates that student's unique situation and seeing what supports might be needed for them. Okay. One thing that I should have mentioned with this last slide, so let me just go back really quick, is that parent involvement is a key element in each one of these phases. So when they're identified, before they can even begin assessing that student, they have to get parents' permission. Once that student has been assessed, they then have to get permission before they can begin developing the IEP. Now they can make suggestions of what may be on the IEP, but as far as being able to actually create the IEP, they have to get the recommendation or get the approval from the parents before they can actually create it. And then they have to as well get their permission before they can implement that plan. So part of that is how can we get parents and families involved in this process? So there's no surefire way to encourage parents' participation, but there are a lot of different strategies that teachers and other staff members can use to encourage parent and family participation. Some of these strategies include incorporating family values and preferences into every aspect of the child's education. So this means in reference to what they're doing in class, if it is maybe for a specific cultural experience that student might have, they want to try to incorporate aspects of that student's culture into their everyday life at school. Another strategy that might be successful is to provide families with specific ways that they can give input, such as sharing their child's strengths and needs, or completing behavioral checklist, or charting the number of words that that student might request help with whenever reading at home. One important aspect of this is also going to be, once the parents have given you input, is to use that input and make sure the parents are aware that that input is appreciated, it's useful, and how it is being used and valued within the creation of the IEP or within the development of that IEP as the reassessment process is being done. Another way that teachers can encourage parent and family participation is to actively advocate for the children and families and to share information with the parents. Also, when communicating with parents, teachers and just general signage around the school should use language that is predominant among the families of the students there. So if the school has a high number of Spanish-speaking students, then they should most likely will have a interpreter, or probably more than one interpreter, on hand to be able to answer any communication or answer any questions that are happening through verbal communication. If there are any kind of written communication that is being sent home to parents, then that should be sent home in a language that is going to be understood by the family. Whenever parents are coming up to the school for whatever reason, if you have a high number of students that are Spanish-speaking students, it'd be very beneficial to have instructions or have signage around the school in that language, so that way people that are unfamiliar with the school or how the school operates can be able to understand these things in their own language. This one is really key because many parents of, or many people in another culture that are coming to the school for whatever reason it might be, even if it has nothing to do with special education services, they want to feel that they are welcomed and that the things that make them unique are not something that is going to be held against them. And so if we as a school are only putting information out there in English, people who do not speak this language, or maybe do not speak it as fluently as they do another language, are going to feel as if their input isn't quite as valued because the information is not being conveyed to them in a way that they are going to be able to understand it and then provide their input. Okay. The next thing I'm going to talk to you about is the different types of scores that can be determined from different assessments. So the three scores that we're going to be discussing are percentile ranks, standard scores, and stanines. Percentile ranks are scores that indicate the percentage of individuals within a norm group that achieved that specific score or lower. So if a student earned a raw score of 40, which has placed them in the 62nd percentile, this means that 62% of students within that norm group earned the raw score of 40 or less. So with this, it's particular to pay attention to that 62% of students have earned that score or less. Not saying that the student in the 62nd percentile received a 62% as a score, but it's more in relation to that student's score with other student scores. The next one is standard scores. These are the ones that are most commonly used. So with this, it is a derived score that transforms the raw score to a new scale with a predetermined mean and standard deviation. This will make a little bit more sense once I show you the visual on the next page that kind of relates all three of these scores with each other. But an example of this is that if the average score, or the mean, is 100, and standard deviation is 15, then a student that earns a score of 70 would then have 2 standard deviations below the mean. The last score that I'm going to be discussing with you is stanines, and in this score, or this type of score, is a derived score that divides the distribution of scores into 9 different segments. Each one of these segments is representative of a percentage of students that are expected to perform at that level. So what this all means when we put it together is, so we have our typical normal distribution of scores, commonly referred to as a bell curve. So this line right down here in the middle refers to the average or the mean. So if we look at the percentile ranks, so when we said that the student would be in the 62nd percentile, we will look along this axis here. We see 60, so 62% would be right about here. So that means if we go all the way up to the mean, that they are slightly above the average score, and that they would fall within this area of at level to slightly above level. In reference to the standard scores and what this means, so we have our mean as 100, and then the standard deviations are going to be these different, just 1 second, go back a page. So the standard deviations are these lines that are along this curve right here. So when I said that a student that would score 70 would be 2 standard deviations below the mean. So we have our mean right here, here's 1 standard deviation and another. We see this lines up with the score of 70. So that raw score of 70, or that raw score has then been converted to this distribution, and then it has ranked them as those 2 standard deviations below the mean. So if we look at this in comparison to the percentile ranks, that student would then fall at about, probably could say, the 3rd percentile, which is saying that 97% of students score higher than they do. The last one that I talked to you guys about was stanine. This one we have is not used very often, but each different segment has been divided into what that percentage, or the expected percentage of student scores in that range. So we have in this mean right here that there is about 20% of the scores are expected to fall right at average. And as we see, we get farther away from that mean, that percentage starts to get smaller and smaller, because it's typically expected that most students are going to kind of fall right in this middle area. The last thing that I'm going to be discussing is the idea of inclusion, or the least restrictive environment, and how all of these services we've been discussing are going to be delivered. So first off, placement in the least restrictive environment is one of the 6 principles of IDEA, or Individuals with Disability Education Act. What this is saying is that schools must educate a student with a disability to the fullest extent with other students who do not have disabilities. This also means that that student should not be pulled from the general education environment unless absolutely necessary. So, special education teachers and general education teachers should try to provide as much support as possible before that student is pulled for whatever reason. So this support can take form as a para being in the classroom. It can be other different modifications that can occur in the learning environment. But essentially we want to keep them in there as much as possible, and they should only be pulled if there are academic challenges or behavioral challenges. Okay. Thank you very much.